Welcome to another episode of the Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit in Western PA whose mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. If you've been watching the Scuttlebutt for some time, you may have listened to a recent episode that we posted. That was a conversation with the Top Gun pilot, James Bartoloni. Bart was his call sign. For most of that episode, he talked about Top Gun, but by the end of it, he started to talk about the psychedelic healing that he went through using psychedelics. This caught the attention of a other recent guest on the Scuttlebutt, Adam Zaffuto. Adam, you may remember if you've watched for some time, was on after the fall of Afghanistan. He is an Army veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. He had a lot of very candid and honest things to say at that time. Adam saw that conversation we had with Bart, and over the last year has actually gone on his own journey of healing through psychedelics. So he wanted to come on and talk with us about that journey, a very open, again, candid and honest conversation about where he was at after the fall of Afghanistan and what the psychedelic healing sessions and the ceremonies helped him to himself. I did very little post-editing here in this episode, and I must give a disclaimer before you listen that the thoughts and feelings and ideas that Adam shares are of his own. They do not express the thoughts and feelings and opinions of the Veterans Breakfast Club. But I do feel that you need to hear all of Adam's truth from his own mouth, because I think all of those things have led him down this path, this journey of healing. So if you have any questions about this episode or about psychedelic healing through psychedelics, you can reach out to me, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Several of the things that Adam suggests we'll put into the description so you can do your own research. He is also a historian in his own right, and I think that he was able to do a lot of research into what psychedelic healing through psychedelics would do for him. So if you're sort of finding this podcast in your journey to say, these other modalities aren't working for me, what about psychedelics? I think this is a great conversation for you. And if you need more information, I can pass you on to Adam, because he's very happy to talk with other veterans about his experience. Please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube so you're the first to know whenever we release new episodes. I do hope you enjoy this conversation. And again, this is a very candid and open conversation. So please keep that in mind as you listen. I think Adam has an incredible story to share. Enjoy the show. Adam, thank you so much for joining us again on the Scuttlebutt. I really appreciate your time coming on. I know we have a lot to get into here, and I want to dive right in because I feel like there's a lot to go over, but I feel like the first question that I want to ask about psychedelic healing is, when did you decide, maybe from even the last time that we talked, people that maybe have watched the Scuttlebutt before, you came on soon after the fall of Kabul, had a lot to say about that, and I feel like there was a point there after that that you found that you needed to heal. And how did you find yourself to psychedelic healing?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's I think a big portion of it was what happened with the fall of Afghanistan, where we were told we weren't going to have helicopters leaving from the roof of the embassy. We weren't going to have a Saigon moment, right? And we had it, times 10, times 100. And it was in that, and I had just become a father. My daughter was just born. And I think all of that, all of the fall of Afghanistan, having the inability to help these people who were begging us for help, begging us to try to get them out of the country, was such an emotional shock to me. It opened up a lot of these wounds that I had thought I was kind of healed from. I had worked with the military psychology clinic at Duquesne for quite some time on healing a lot of those wounds, and saw a tremendous amount of healing. And it was like in those moments of watching that collapse happen, watching our administration just blatantly lie to us, was these scars were being ripped open. And I was reliving all of these things and having to re-experience all of the trauma that is just, it's everywhere in people who've been to Afghanistan. I think that it's something that you see how stark life is for these people, and the hell that we had just kind of sentenced a generation of young Afghan girls to. And part of that was I had just had a daughter, and I was seeing hundreds of little passport photos of little Americans. We must have had 24 American citizens, little babies. It's a US passport with their face. And I couldn't help but see my daughter's face in each and every one of these Afghan names with a little picture and going, my God, we just abandoned these people. We abandoned American citizens because they have an Afghan name or their parents are from Afghanistan. So we just abandoned them. And I was starting to see my daughter's face in all of them. I would go hold my daughter as she would cry as a little baby. And I would see the faces of these Afghan children in her. Mm-hmm. And I would just names just running through my head of all of these names of all of these children that we had left behind. And it was this moment of also something I don't think's talked about a lot is 1 in 4 men experience some sort of postpartum. You know, it's being talked about a lot more with women.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is they have this massive experience, this huge hormone dump and all of that. But we don't talk a lot about that. A lot of men actually have instances of postpartum. And I think everything that happened in Afghanistan, having my baby, this constant, like night after night after night trauma of trying to work, trying to do something, led me into a pretty deep depression. And I was like very, very down in these moments. And I've said it before, is I felt robbed of the first few months of my daughter's life. It was supposed to be filled with joy. And instead I was just overcome with sadness and with despair and with horror over like, what the hell did we just do? What did we just do? Over what? And that to me was these moments of like, oh my God. And then we Thanksgiving kind of rolled around and we had a friend in to see us. Alex's cousin was in town and we got to talking about, you know, what happened in Afghanistan and how I was doing. I said, yeah, not well, you know, not well. These people are still there. We're still, you know, trying to figure out how we might be able to get somebody out. And we had a private security team go over to Tajikistan and try to build some rat lines to get people out of the country. And the State Department pulled them out. And it was like, my God, like we're trying to do something here and we're being stonewalled at every single way by the government, by our government was stopping us from doing this. And I had felt such a deep wound from that. And we got to talking about, you know, healing and she had done her own work with psychedelics and then now actually leads psychedelic retreats and does psychedelic integration work with a healing center out in California that actually provides psychedelic ceremonies.
Was this the first you had heard about psychedelic healing?
No, I had heard about it. I had heard about ayahuasca. I had heard about MDMA therapy for veterans, but it was especially the ayahuasca seemed like, oh, well, that's, I don't know, that's a little too far out there. I had felt like, oh, maybe, you know, if it presents itself to me. And one of the moments in my life of like, oh, you know, was right after when Afghanistan was collapsing. I was like, very interested in that. Like, oh, I'm starting to feel it even before my daughter was born. Like, oh, these wounds are being ripped open. Like area.
And your daughter was born. I'm guessing you probably didn't sleep a whole bunch for.
No, those first couple months, like that's, I think the thing that everybody tells you like, oh, you're not going to sleep, but it's like,
no
it's
one
a level of sleeplessness. Yeah.
That sleep deprivation can wreck you. I
felt very reminiscent to my time in Iraq where we were, you know, we were doing constant daily patrols through a city, coming back, sleeping for a couple of hours, and then doing either night patrols, dismounted night patrols in the city, or doing raids, doing night raids into the city. And so we were sleeping like very sporadically and in parts and pieces. And I remember like those first days when they sent us back to Kirkuk as we were kind of heading down to Kuwait to get out of country, like I slept for like 2 days straight. Just because like we hadn't had any time to like fully decompress and sleep. And that's what it felt very reminiscent of like, you don't get a full 8 hours, you get 3 hours here, a couple hours there. And it takes a massive toll on your mental health, your physical health as well.
Yep.
And so I had kind of heard about ayahuasca and I'd heard about MDMA therapy, but for the MDMA stuff, it was all Rick Doblin talking on Joe Rogan's program and a couple of other podcasts he had done where he talks about it. And it's all couched around like the idea of treatment resistant PTSD, right? And that's something that like, I don't have treatment resistant PTSD. Like, I was diagnosed with PTSD when I got out, went and did 6 years of counseling with the Duquesne Psychology Clinic, and saw a tremendous amount of healing in that. So I wasn't treatment resistant, but there was always this thing of like, well, maybe I know that healing is available. I know that I'm able to heal from these things. These wounds have now been ripped open again. And I don't particularly have another 6 years. Like, I need to be the best father possible for my daughter.
Right.
And so we started.
Can I interrupt real quick and ask a question? So this is the first I've heard the term treatment resistant PTSD. Does that, let me clarify, is it a PTSD that is resistant to treatment, or is it like a, I'm trying to understand that in the sense of any treatment, it doesn't help, or you're just trying to find the right treatment that will treat it?
So I think one of the things that maybe we'll put a little context around it is Rick Doblin at the it's called the Multidisciplinary Association on Psychedelic Studies. Rick Doblin is a psychologist and psychiatrist who has at this point gotten the FDA to admit that MDMA is a breakthrough therapy for PTSD. Now, how did he do that? It got banned in the 80s, but MDMA was developed in 1910 by, I believe, Merck Pharmaceuticals. And it was used as a psychotherapy aid. And it had this long history from 1910 until about 1980, when it kind of broke out of the psychotherapy world and made itself into the club scene, into the drug scene, right? And so it got blacklisted by the government, and the whole scare tactics of, oh, people are taking it and they're dying. Well, they were dying from dehydration. They weren't dying from MDMA. They're dying from taking MDMA, dancing packed in a club and not drinking any water, and they overheat and they die. People do that out in the desert. People go hiking and they die. We don't stop people from hiking. You know?
Yeah.
And so it had this long history of use as a psychotherapy aid, and then it gets just blacklisted by the government. And Rick Doblin had experiences with MDMA, had experiences with MDMA healing ceremonies and healing sessions, and said like, hey, this is very wrong. And so he goes on this now 40-some year crusade to get it legalized again and to get the government to admit this is a therapy. And so his initial start was after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He said, hey, you're sending back a generation of veterans with PTSD, and some of them, nothing works. Some of them saw something, experienced something that was so traumatic that they're completely incapable of healing from any other modality that we have. Counseling's not working. Antidepressants aren't working. Antipsychotics aren't working. Outdoor exposure therapy isn't working. Nothing is working. Let me try this. Let me try this. And so he had his phase 1 study, and they saw tremendous results. Something like a 96, they did like a dozen veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD, and they saw like a 90-something% reduction in symptoms. And then something like 80+% of them no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. Wow. I mean, tell me another therapy, tell me another drug out there that has any sort of statistics like that.
I think the only one, and maybe this is if people that have been listening to the Scuttlebutt for a while, we talked about the injection straight into the, like that one has been tested lately at the Stella, I think it's called the Stella Center. I'll edit that if need be.
Ganglion block.
Right. So that might be near that. I know that for those that it works, it's really a high percentage of veterans who, if it works.
I have a friend who did one of those stellar ganglion blocks and said his experience to me was this experience of like, I went from walking down a crowded street in New York City with car horns blaring and people all around me to I'm walking through the woods and it is perfectly calm and quiet. Like that much of a just wow. You know? And so those are these new therapies that we're seeing. And so Rick Doblin then went on to open up the phase 2 trial to also include women who had been victims of sexual assault and rape and had PTSD from this. And what do you know? Exact same results. And they open it up to their big phase 3 trial with, 1,000+ veterans. What do you know? Exact same results. And the way that they're kind of, they're their process worked is you have 3 MDMA sessions, and then prior to and then after each session, you have integration work. So where you're working with a counselor or somebody to help integrate these lessons and these things that you've seen, these lessons learned. How do you integrate that into your life now? Because that's the real important part about psychedelics is, I think in America, we look for the pill, the cure. Go ahead and turn your TV on, and what is every other commercial? It's some pharmaceutical company selling you some drug that you don't need for a thing that you don't have. You know, but hey, that's going to be the thing that fixes it. That's going to be the thing that fixes, oh, that if I take that pill, I'll be fixed.
Yeah.
Right. And the answer is like, no, it's just going to cause something else. It's going to cause some down the road thing. And with psychedelics, you have to look at it in this way of like, oh, this is just a tool that helps open my heart up, open my consciousness up to see the changes that are available. And then it's incumbent upon me to actually do the work. Right. And so that's the thing is, so the way Rick Doblin was doing this was 3 MDMA sessions, integration work, well, intention setting before it. So you go in with, what is your intention, right? What's your intention of going into this ceremony? And then you have your ceremony, and then it's integrating. What are you integrating after this? How do you want to move forward with this new information you have, this expanded consciousness awareness that you have? How are you going to actually like integrate that and move that more forward in your life? And that's what I've been doing.
So what made that decision? What did you say? Like, I need that. Let's try that because this isn't working.
It was seeing these wounds being reopened after Afghanistan, and then talking with my wife's cousin Sloan about that she does this work, that she does the integration work. She can basically set this all up for me. And it was, I didn't need to do any more research. I had heard enough podcasts and I had listened to enough things. And it was this being presented to me in a way of like, this can help you. And I know it can help you because I've seen it help other people. And I had seen all of the Joe Rogan podcasts on it and was like, oh, okay.
Well, you're also kind of a rare breed that you kind of already had done your homework and you had a bit of ease of access to it. So later on, let's talk about how we can get veterans who may not have done the homework, may not have heard about this, where they need to go and who they need to find. But let's continue on with your journey. You said, great, I'm going to do this. What was your first step?
My first step was having a discussion. Well, I had initially been like, oh, you know what? I think it's ayahuasca. I think I want to do ayahuasca. And so it was like, okay, well, we can do ayahuasca, but there's a lot of healing that has to happen before you go do ayahuasca. Because if you go into an ayahuasca ceremony in a, you know, scatterbrain, post-traumatic stress kind of mindset, like you're not going to have the experience that you want, you know? And just like I had been this, had this idea when I didn't want to do psychedelics when I got out of the military, because I was like, I want to be in the right mind space for this. I want to have, before I have any psychedelic experiences, I want to be in the right mind space. And it had always kind of been in the back of my mind. I had never done any psychedelics in high school or in college or in the military. Like it was just, it's all right. I get it. You guys want to do, that's fine. It's not for me. Not right now. Maybe that's not for me, but it's not right now. You know, I need to be in the correct mind space, correct head
and
space.
a safe space in general.
Yes. Yeah. And so talking with the people at the healing center and talking with Sloan, and we kind of discussed like, well, ayahuasca journeying for you. Yeah. But first let's work on healing, and let's work on healing, you know, from these wounds that have been reopened, and also a lot of wounds that like maybe weren't fully closed. And I thought I had come to terms with, I thought I had seen the healing in it, but it's like, you know, after surgery, right? It's like, oh yeah, feels great, but it's not completely healed.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what that Afghanistan experience was. Was these wounds that I thought were healed really truly weren't. And when it got tested, you know, I learned that these wounds weren't healed. And there was still a lot of healing that needed to happen.
Totally.
So then we discussed that and we said, okay, well, I think the best path forward is to do an ayahuasca ceremony after you've done 3 MDMA ceremonies. And that's kind of the exact same protocol that Rick Doblin had been using, minus the ayahuasca.
Now, you say MDMA ceremony. What does that involve?
So the way that Rick Doblin and they did theirs was, since it was all very clinical, it was all very medicalized. You do it in a kind of a clinical, like a psychologist's office, but in a hospital. You're laying back on a bed, and there's a male and a female psychologist there, and they're helping talk you through it. This was more, I describe it as a shamanic ceremony, like a healing ceremony. So it was much less medicalized, and that spoke to me of like, I'm not interested in the medicalized treatment. I had like gone through the VA and seen like they'll give you any drug you ask for. You don't really feel any better. And so for me, it was like, I don't want a medicalized healing. I want to look at this as a spiritual healing. And so that was kind of what we decided on, is 3 MDMA ceremonies and then an ayahuasca ceremony down the line. And so, so ceremony is just kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's just a ceremony where you go into that ceremony and you enter this ceremony with like, what is your intention? Right.
What was yours?
I had all of these ideas, right? Especially my first one. Like, oh, I have to make it so big and so meaningful. Like, and I had like struggled with, what am I going to make my intention and blah, blah. And when I got there, it just honestly felt like, oh, the first step is just to accept a healing path, accept a healing journey. Right. And so I just set my intention on, I'm going to accept a healing journey in my life. And that became my intention for that ceremony. And then prior to taking the MDMA, we did some like meditative breath work where you're kind of breathing from your diaphragm, where like I think breathe a lot like with our chest, but
we do.
You can actually breathe a lot with your diaphragm, and you can get into a very good rhythm of like just exercising your diaphragm. And so what we did is, for about an hour, we did this kind of just breathing in a very like kind of an elevated breathing pattern of
rhythmic and
very rhythmic.
Sort of, very. I took yoga. I practiced yoga for quite a number of years, and that there's a different way of breathing through that drops you into your center a bit more. Connects you. It like connects you, roots you.
And so about every 15 minutes during this breathing work, the guide for my ceremony is a wonderful man, a good friend named Attila. And so every 15 minutes, he would have me just yell and try to match the same kind of tone, like, that he was yelling at. And try to match that, and then slamming my arms and legs onto this mattress I was laying on. Right now, to set the scene a little bit, we're in a beautiful house kind of overlooking Monterey Bay, Santa Cruz, California. And they have a little healing room they built off the top of their driveway with this beautiful glass windows looking out over Monterey Bay. And it's like, it's like a very beautiful place to be having this experience. And so you're laying there and and you do that for about 2 minutes. And as you kind of like go back into your breathing, you can start to get visions, and you can start to see things like you're under a blindfold and you have your eyes closed, but when and what that is like, the physiology of that is you're increasing the levels of oxygen and increasing the levels of CO2 in your blood, and that you're increasing CO2 levels, and it helps to like, you can listen. I got visions before even doing MDMA through using those techniques, and you start to see these like just they start to come into focus, pictures and visions, right? So we did that for about an hour, and then we go and drink some water and sit down and discuss like, okay, what is the intention I want to have for this ceremony? And that's where I decided like, oh, I want to accept a healing journey. And then kind of discussed with me like the options. You can have the 2 MDMA pills, and then
what is that like? and correct me if I'm
Yeah,
wrong,
sure.
is that like acid, or what is MDMA?
MDMA is a chemical compound that it's doesn't have the visual effects of LSD or of
Okay.
psilocybin,
Right.
right? High dose psilocybin, LSD, you'll see visions in your eyes. Whereas how MDMA works is it causes a massive outpouring of dopamine,
Oh,
right?
okay. Yeah.
Causes this massive outpouring of dopamine and of serotonin instead of things like psychedelics like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, it is like one or two molecules off of serotonin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your body sees it and goes, oh, click, put that right into the serotonin receptors, click, 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 everything starts working, and then it starts having its effect. Whereas MDMA works by having like causing your brain to have an outflow of all of these chemicals, dopamine, serotonin start pouring out, and that your brain keeps creating it. Oh, wow, wow.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a different experience than something like LSD or
I think
psilocybin.
that's a good important thing to understand, especially for veterans who may be looking into this,
Yeah.
who may not understand what that is. Like,
Yeah.
how is this different from like psychedelics that I hear
Yes.
about on,
Traditional psychedelics of
right. Yeah.
the Vietnam age of these guys were doing acid and stuff like that. It's like, it's different. And also I think before we talk about like my journey is to talk a little bit about the, like, what are the actual physiological effects of something like MDMA on the body and on the brain. And one of the things that MDMA does, and it becomes very apparent once you're aware of what this is doing, you can see it much more clearly of like, oh, I get it, is MDMA actually shuts down the fear centers of your brain. So it shuts down that little lizard portion of your brain in the amygdala that is like, be afraid, be terrified, protect yourself, protect your ego, right?
Yeah.
And at like the psychological levels, you can try to understand that. And you can try to understand what it would be like to not have fear. But I don't believe that that's particularly available to the average human being who hasn't done a tremendous amount of meditative work or yoga or things like that.
Yeah.
And so MDMA actually works on shutting down the fear centers of your brain. So you like psychologically cannot like process fear. So when people talk about like your higher self,
Yeah.
in Quaker theology, they call it like the inward light, that spiritual higher self, in like Buddhism, in it's described, I believe it's called the Atman, right? You're like higher self.
Yeah.
And it's that higher self that's not being acted upon by your amygdala. And that's a like very characteristic thing inside of PTSD is an overactive amygdala. Your brain is constantly processing everything as fear.
Right.
Because of the experiences, PTSD is a normal human response to abnormal circumstances.
And it's been conditioned over time to just be like, and that's what that stellate ganglion shot is all about too. That's where I was making the connection there of like, how is psychedelic healing also shutting down the fight or flight to help you to think more clearly and feel more calm.
Yes. Yeah. And so in that you have your brain, the brain of somebody with who I don't particularly like even agree with the post-traumatic stress disorder. And I heard somebody once say like, PTSD is a disease, and once you have it, you have it. It's there forever. And like, I don't agree with that. I do not agree with that it is a forever diagnosis. I believe that just like many things, you can heal from it. You have to be able to see inside of like, well, what are the things that are actually helping me? For me, I took SSRIs when I got out of the Army and for like 3 weeks and was like, oh, this is not helping. Everything felt flat and everything felt gray and there was no ups and there was no downs. Well, I know what feeling good feels like. I know what feeling bad feels like. This is just, I'd rather not do that. And so I stopped taking those very quickly. And I know that some people have seen a lot of benefit from that. I personally, they were not for me.
Right.
And I think that viewing it through that lens of like, oh, my brain conditioned itself to be very wary and to be very fearful because of experiences that I had. in Iraq, experiences that I had in Afghanistan, right? It was a conditioned response to abnormal circumstances.
Totally.
And that's the part of your brain that, for an infantryman who's been in combat, when you hear something like a boom, you immediately go into like the crowd,
Ducking,
like, oh,
duck and cover, and
yeah. And that's a conditioned response. The same way that you, when you hear a round snap over your head, oh shit, you know?
Yeah.
Your body conditions itself for survival. Well, I exist in a situation in a world now where, Sean, I don't have to particularly worry about, you know, survival.
That's right.
And that was something that for me, like when I got out of the army and I was going to school at Duquesne, like I would walk out of class and listen, it sounds crazy, but I would look for snipers. As you look up at the rooftops, you look for people and you look, is there somebody watching me? Is there somebody on a radio?
Yeah.
You know, but that's a conditioned response to having been in urban combat.
Right.
You know, having experienced urban combat, having experienced patrolling in a city, having been ambushed inside of a city, like those are the things that you start looking for, and it becomes a natural reaction. Even though I could tell myself in my brain, there's no snipers in Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't compute, because that lizard part of your brain, at the very base of your brain, the amygdala, right? One of the first thing that forms inside of your brain is telling you, watch out for snipers, buddy. Look out for that bag of trash on the road because it might blow up.
Right.
You know?
Totally.
Those are conditioned responses. Even though I know there's no IEDs on Route 28, I know that.
Right.
My brain tells
the biggest
me,
bomb in Pittsburgh is the Pirates, so you don't have to worry about it. I'll be here all day.
Yeah. But that's a thing, right? It's like at the base of my brain, it was telling me, no, you need to be wary of IEDs and of snipers and of rocket propelled grenade, all these things.
Yeah.
You can intellectually tell yourself that, but still your brain is going like, yeah, but still watch out.
Right.
You know? Okay. All right.
So you get to the point where they're like, okay, you could take these 2 pills.
Yep.
Or what's the other option?
You can take the 2 MDMA pills, and I believe it was 120 milligrams. I believe 260 milligram capsules. And then if you would like to go deeper, you can take a third, about an hour in. And I've kind of always lived with the, you know, the virtues of I'm here for the full experience. That was part of kind of what sent me into the army and into the infantry, was like, I'm going to college, I'm at IUP, and a lot like Chris Taylor in the movie Platoon, like I wasn't learning anything, you know?
Yeah.
And like, why should all the poor kids have to go off and fight and all the rich kids get to sit around and go to college? Like, no, I want the experience of going to war. And there's very few times in, you know, in American history where you can join the military and be guaranteed to go see combat. And for me, it was like that experience of combat is what I was seeking out, and sought it out, went to Iraq, and, you know, like a lot of young men, the experience of combat is so intense and it is so otherworldly, and you live at the exact edge of being alive. It's that razor's edge of being alive and being dead, and you've never felt fully alive until you have almost died, you know, until you've had that, like that just missed, and you feel like that's what it is to be alive. And so I went back to Afghanistan for that, seeking out that adrenaline and that adventure, right? And the first time I got shot at in Afghanistan was like, that was not what I was fucking interested in. Like, okay, maybe we should have thought about that. But it's that part of what, now I was a sergeant, and now I had men that were underneath me that I had to command, and I was responsible for their lives. And having to think about telling my good friend Ellis Cedeno's wife that he had been killed because I had made a decision to put a mortar here instead of put a mortar there was like, oh, fuck. That's a heavy weight to have to carry. It's a heavier burden that a sergeant carries in combat than as a rifleman just running around the streets of Iraq. You're just keeping yourself and your buddy alive, you know? Do what you're told, right? As a sergeant, you have a much heavier weight of these men's lives. Justin Hunter and Ellis Cedeno's life were like hey, they belong to me. Those are my guys. Those are my soldiers. I am responsible for them to the point I'm responsible whether or not they live or die.
Yeah,
You know, and that's a heavy weight to have to carry.
totally.
A little bit different in that when it happens in the other way. And for them, it was their first experience of combat.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're living the life as an infantryman in combat. Like, hey, just stay alive. You know.
This is a side rabbit
Yeah.
hole, and maybe hopefully not too in depth, but
Yeah.
the same way you're conditioned when you walk out of class and you're looking up at the rooftops for snipers,
Yeah.
does your mind and body get conditioned as a staff sergeant that if you go out with your buddies now to the bar and you guys are hanging out at night, do you feel that same need to, like, I need to protect the guys that I'm with, just my buddies, we're just out here having a drink?
I think possibly in some way you feel much more, you feel like, and that's a reason of why you do become a sergeant, is because you are a little bit more able to see things in a bigger picture, to see things more tactically, more strategically.
Yeah.
And so I think that was part of it, is like, yeah, having a desire to like be more responsible and to have that responsibility. Yeah,
Totally.
I think so.
All right, so back to the journey.
Yeah.
Which one did you chose then to take the 2 and then take them to extra 1 the hour
Yeah.
later?
Yeah. And and so took the first 2 MDMA capsules and I put my blindfold on, and Attila put on some music that is very kind of soft, soothing, rhythmic, kind of like the Ikeros that are sung by the shamans in the Amazon during ayahuasca ceremonies.
Right.
Right.
And this is you and how many other people?
Just me and Attila.
Oh, okay.
Guide. So he's the guide. He is there to help ground me and to keep me, keep me safe in this ceremony.
Did you feel that you trusted him? You walked in, this is the first time you ever met him. You felt like, I feel comfortable with this person to lead me on this very, very important journey.
Yeah, we had one discussion on Zoom.
Okay.
And then me going out there to California. And it's just him and his wife and his wife's sister, they do this psychedelic work.
Okay.
And they have such a calming and loving presence about them that you immediately feel not only at home, but safe and able to open up and be fully immersed in this experience with them. They're just an incredible group of people who are doing amazing work, And so took the 2 MDMA capsules, put my blindfold on. Attila plays some music and is sitting there with me. And I think, like everybody having their first experience with a drug, you go like, okay, when is it going to kick in?
Mm-hmm.
Like, did I take a dud? Did I get a dud? Like, yeah. Is it going to work? Maybe it just doesn't affect me. Maybe it's not hitting me. And then I was going like this. And I was like, oh.
We're rubbing your chest.
It's so fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wearing a shirt and I was like, oh, it's so fuzzy. And then I just said to Attila, I said, oh, it's starting. And he just kind of laughed a little bit like, yes, brother, it is. It's starting. And so then it starts that you start feeling the medicine starting to take effect. And the best way I can describe the initial portions of it is like a clay modeler working on a clay spinning wheel, right? Yeah. But I was molding balls of love. Now I'm wearing a blindfold and my eyes are closed, but I can see that I'm molding and forming balls of love, just pulling this energy and this love out of the air. And I would breathe it in, I'd pull it into my face and breathe in this love. And then I'd go and I'd build another ball of love and I'd pull it down into the center of my heart. And I did that for like probably 10 minutes. And then it really started to hit me, right? And I was going into having the first experience. And at that point, I was about an hour in, because the MDMA has about a 30 to 40 minute kind of uptake cycle. So it takes about 40 minutes for it to really hit you. And so you're not particularly feeling anything because the effect is very gradual. As it kind of rises in you, it's a very gradual rise. And so that's where you're like, did I get a dud? Is it not going to work? You're just not fully feeling it. And it is so gradual that until it kind of like, oh, it's there, I'm feeling it. Mm-hmm. And so then I took the third MDMA pill. And for anybody's wondering, it's just it looks like pink rock salt, basically.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of what, like small crystals of pink rock salt, right?
Yeah.
Inside of a clear gelatin capsule, right? And so I took the third one, and then that helps boost up the next kind of as that experience goes on.
Mhm.
The first experience I had was, I think the best way to describe it is it was like I was watching a movie, but I couldn't press fast forward.
Mhm.
I could only press pause. And I could press pause by putting my hand on the ground. And it would, like, I could open my eyes under the blindfold and put my hand on the ground. And that would kind of ground me to be like, oh, that's right. I'm in Santa Cruz, California.
Mhm.
I'm here. I'm in my body. Okay. All right. I'm all right. And I could bring my hands back to my chest. And then it was like I said, I couldn't press fast forward, but I could hit play again. You know, like when you're watching
Yeah.
something on your DVR and it's like fast forward is, you can't fast forward through the commercials.
Yeah,
You gotta
yeah.
watch them, right?
Right.
It was like, but these experiences. And I was having this experience that I had in Iraq where I had to make a decision to shoot a child, basically. And I was in the gun turret of our truck, and this kid had followed us, like a 8 or 9-year-old kid, had followed us for multiple blocks.
And let me
And
clarify, this was a real thing that did happen.
This is a real thing that
Okay.
happened in
Go
Iraq,
ahead.
in the city of Hawija.
Yeah.
My driver, Noah Price, was sitting, in the driver's seat. I was in the gun turret, and we had pushed our dismounts out ahead of our patrol, and we were the rear truck.
Mhm.
And that was kind of normal for us, as the rear truck would get attacked with hand grenades. So this kid was walking up block after block after block, getting closer and closer and closer to us until our convoy stopped. And it stopped right in the middle of right in the middle of Northbridge, which was the street that we always got attacked on in Hawija. Was the street called Northbridge. And the convoy stopped, and if you stop for too long in a place like that, you are going to get attacked. It's just going to happen. And this kid walks up next to the truck, and like Noah had called him out a couple of blocks ago. And so I had watched this kid walk up. I saw him there. And so I kind of popped myself even farther up out of the turret and was drawn right down on this kid. And I took my rifle off safe, and I was drawn right down on this kid. And I can distinctly remember the image of his face right in between the reticle of my EOTech. He had what looked to be like if you stick a Gatorade bottle in your shorts, right, in one of your pockets. It's just bulging out. It's clearly there. But what it was a 60 millimeter mortar round. That this was pretty common for them. They would take 60 millimeter mortar rounds, and they would take the tail fins out, take the fuses out. They would pack those with homemade explosives, and then they would stick a Russian hand grenade fuse into there and create kind of a super powered hand grenade out of a 60 millimeter mortar round.
And send a kid after you.
Yeah. And so I had to make this decision, like, okay, if the moment that hand grenade comes out of his pocket, I'm going to kill him. And okay, take my rifle off safe, start to squeeze the slack out of my trigger. And in that moment, he looked up at me, and he saw me, and he saw that I had him dead to rights. And then he looked up the street, and this whole time I'm screaming on my radio, like, hey, get somebody back here, like quick, like send guys back here. And in that moment, he looked at me, he looked up the street and saw all of our dismounts running towards him, looked back at me, and took off running. And in that moment, the adrenaline dump hit me, and I was like, oh God, like,
right.
What just happened? What did you just do? And making the decision to kill a child, to kill an 8-year-old kid is like, that is a heavy weight to have to bear.
Yeah, unbelievable.
So I saw this all again, and what I kind of described it as is, it's not so scary the second time you watch a scary movie, because you know what's going to happen. And so I knew what was going to happen, but what it was I had to see the lesson, right? And I had to see what happened. I had to see it through a different lens, a lens where my amygdala, my fear center of my brain, wasn't overloading me with the feelings of fear in that moment. And instead, I was able to look at that through the lens of love. And that's something that I think the MDMA experience allows you, is when you remove all of that fear and you remove all of that judgment from your your thought process. You look at things through the lens of love.
Yeah.
And I saw in that moment, oh, I was a 23-year-old kid put in an unspeakably bizarre scenario, being asked to make choices that are so unbearable that I would never wish that upon anyone, to have to make a decision like that. Now, thank God that kid looked at me, looked and saw our dismounts and took off running. And I didn't have to shoot that kid. But I know that I made that decision. Like, I'm going to kill this kid. And I'm going to have to do it right here on the street in front of all of these people, right? And have to live with that. And in that moment of watching it again, right? And in that moment of seeing it again and looking at it through the lens of love, I saw that I was a 23-year-old kid making incredibly difficult decisions and having to make incredibly difficult decisions. But I was doing them out of love.
Yeah.
Out of love for my brother, out of love for my friends, out of love for myself, of making these decisions. It wasn't out of hate. I didn't hate that kid.
No.
I didn't want to kill that kid. I wanted him to live, and thank God he did. But it was out of love of protecting my brother, my driver, who can't, he's driving a truck, he can't protect himself.
Right.
And then as that lesson and that lesson hits you of like, oh, you were operating out of love. The only way that I can describe it is like the feeling of what it must feel like and what it's going to feel like at the end of my journey when I go and I meet God. Right? I got hit from the top of my head and it flowed down to my heart and then exploded out through all of my limbs. The feeling of love and of acceptance. Love and acceptance. Overwhelming waves of love and acceptance. Love and acceptance. Love and acceptance. It's like, oh God. And it was like, that's what it is. You see these things, you learn this lesson.
Yeah.
And then kind of the next thing started. The next experience started.
Before we go to that, was there a feeling of having to forgive yourself for the decision that you might have had to make?
No, there wasn't a feeling of having to forgive myself because I looked at it through a different lens.
Okay.
Because I don't see it particularly as forgiving myself because there's nothing to forgive there.
Right.
Is the way that I view it now. Like, yeah, for a long time I was like, oh, I need to forgive myself for this. But in truth, I didn't need to forgive myself for anything. I was doing the absolute best I could with the information and the knowledge that I had available to me at the time. And the knowledge and the information that I had available to me at the time was, hey, they're using kids to throw grenades at our rear trucks. I'm in the rear truck. That's a kid with a grenade. What do I think is going to happen? That kid's going to throw a hand grenade at me.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Now, I didn't see through the lens of hate that I hated that kid. What I saw was this love and this acceptance. And what I've come to terms with is I'm not mad at myself. I'm not mad at the generals who put us there. I'm not mad at anybody who my actual bone, who I have a bone to pick with is who's the fucking monster who gives a 9-year-old kid a hand grenade and sends it to go throw that hand grenade at the Americans. Now, they knew that kid was most likely going to get killed, but that was the goal. They wanted me to shoot that kid so that the whole city would erupt. The Americans killed a kid and the whole city would erupt into a ball of fire.
Yeah.
And it was in that moment of like, that's who I have a problem with. What kind of monster sends a child to go, you're too scared? What? You don't have the guts to throw a grenade at me yourself, so you send a child to do it? Like,
yeah.
At least have the guts to fight me,
Yeah.
That's what we're here for,
Yeah.
And so that's like I said, I don't think it wasn't that I forgave myself. It was that I saw it through a different lens. I saw it through this lens of love. Being able to look at it through this lens of love. Right. And that was the real lesson is all of these things are done out of love.
Yeah.
And so my journey kept going on and you start to have more of these experiences. And it was an experience in Afghanistan of having to tell a Pashtun father we were in the Arghandab River Valley of like having to bring over one of my interpreters. And we had to go tell this guy that like, your daughter died. And I remember telling him his daughter had picked up a hand grenade or a 40 millimeter grenade or something like that. And it had detonated. And having to tell him that his daughter died in this moment of like, telling him that his daughter died, and it just like didn't even shake him. And he said, "What about my son?" And we had to say, like, "Your son died as well."
Oh boy.
And in that moment, he collapsed, like,
Yeah.
just fell to pieces. And I had this moment of like, there in Afghanistan, of like physically standing over this man and having to be like, "I told you your daughter died and you felt nothing. I tell you your son dies and you go to pieces." And it was this like, yeah, I had this like moment of cultural insensitivity of being like, you don't give a shit about your daughter, but you fall to pieces about your son. Like, how can you do that? And I had this moment of, as I saw the lesson, was like, he just didn't understand love in the same way that we understand love. He doesn't see the value of his daughter in the same way that I can see the value and the love for my daughter. And I can look at my daughter now with this immense amount of love and knowing how important it is for her to have opportunities in this world.
Yeah.
And got hit with another one of those waves of love and of acceptance, love and of acceptance.
Yeah.
And the journey goes on for about 3 or 4 hours of that.
Wow.
You're seeing these lessons.
Yeah.
And you see this lesson, and then you get hit with the waves of love and of acceptance, love and of acceptance.
And is Attila, how is he guiding you at this point? Does he chime in? Does he?
He's more there just to like, you can, in the way that I kind of journey during psychedelics is like, I'm very internal. It's all going on inside of me. And then I'll like speak out a little bit about something that I kind of want to discuss later. And that's kind of how the ceremony goes. Is you have your ceremony, then after it, we sat and talked for a couple of hours just about these experiences and about these things. And talking to Attila, I would tell him just a little bit about what was happening. And then he's just there to kind of reassert the love that I know is already there. You know, and you're loved, everything is here, you're accepted, you're loved. And to have that like physical connection, to hold somebody's hand for a little bit, and these like very like, oh, like world shaking moments, right?
Yeah, totally. And
he's playing a drum a little bit to help draw you deeper into the experience and to pull you deeper into the experience. And it was one of those things of like, we medicalize things so much in our society, and we've removed the ability for our medical professionals to talk about the spirit or spiritual healing. When people like Dr. Brooke at the Duquesne University, like psychology clinic, like, no, that's what they're talking about is moral wounds, spiritual wounds. Dr. Ed Tick done incredible work on this. Listen, we can't continue to medicalize these things that Terence McKenna, a very well-known psychedelic explorer, talks about every culture having archaic revivals, and that like the idea of classicism wasn't even invented or thought about until the Renaissance, right? Until during the Renaissance, these cultures, these societies that were seeing the French Revolution and all of these societies collapsing had an archaic revival of human beings naturally look back to a time when things made sense. And so they looked back at the classicists of Plato and Aristotle and Epictetus, and they look back at these and they say, oh, look at all of these things, and they bring that in, right? And I think we're going through an archaic revival now in our society where we are having to talk about spirituality and having to talk about, we cannot continue to medicalize these things that aren't medical. Right. These wounds that men come back from combat with are spiritual wounds. They are moral wounds. They're moral injury. It's an injury to your spirit and to your soul. And if the medical community cannot admit that there is a soul, then how can they heal it? Right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about that on a different level of like, if we're going to heal our spirit, if we're going to heal our wounds, we have to be willing to admit that this isn't a medical issue. This is an issue of the spirit and an issue of the soul.
Right.
And that's what these warrior cultures in the past always had they were in touch with, they were in tune with, right? The Spartans and the Greek, city-states, they had these ideas of Ares, the god of war, right? And they had these ideas of these spirits that flowed through the battlefield, and the spirit of fear And that when fear would hit would take root in some soldier and he would turn and run, it would flow and wash across an entire formation. And that's how you get routes of armies. We're seeing that today with the Russian army, right? The Ukrainians have embraced the spirit of Ares, the god of war, and they are making impressive, massive gains far beyond their military capabilities. And the Russians have been overcome with the spirit of fear. And they're dropping and they're running and they're leaving entire tank companies abandoned behind. All of their equipment and all of their ammo, right?
Yeah.
That is the spirit of fear flowing through these armies and causing them to retreat. In the same way that it happened on Greek battlefields, it's happening on Ukrainian battlefields today. And when we try to medicalize things and we don't talk about the spirit and we don't talk about the soul, we don't get to that actual healing.
Right.
You can't mask over these wounds with SSRIs. You can't mask over these wounds with alcohol and with cannabis and with all of these other things that we try to mask them with.
Right.
When the truth is, we have to go confront these things. And maybe it's too much to confront them sober. So let's use a drug that was used as a psychotherapy aid.
Right.
Well, let's do that. And I don't believe that it has to be done with a psychologist, and I don't believe that it has to be done with a psychiatrist. But I also don't believe that it has, that it's just for combat vets. I also don't believe that this is just for people with trauma. I believe that we can all see a tremendous amount of healing through the proper use of psychedelics, through looking back at these cultures and how they had psychedelic experiences. How did our Native American cultures experience psychedelics, right? It wasn't these guys, they didn't just go around and eat psychedelic mushrooms or take peyote, right? And in the Amazon, they weren't just going out and drinking ayahuasca, right?
Yeah.
They used these things in a ceremonial way.
Right.
And that's the important thing, is using them in the correct set and setting with the correct intention. We're not using this to have a good time on a Friday night, right?
Right.
We're not using this to go to a music, to go to a
Woodstock-ish
event,
event.
Woodstock, to go to a rave. We're not using it to enhance that.
No.
We're using it for healing, right? And there is an entire, world going on right now inside of the veteran community of veterans who are saying, listen, the VA isn't helping me and the government doesn't know what the they're doing. We're going to heal ourselves and we're going to use psychedelics to do that. And you know what? You can't tell me that the government has any place in telling me how to heal myself after they have failed so spectacularly on so many levels. They have no right, they have no reason, and they have no place to tell me what I can and cannot do to heal myself from the wounds of a war that they sent me into, right?
Yeah.
They can't, they have no legitimacy anymore to tell me about anything that I can do to heal myself. And when we're talking about the spirit, that's where we get into the ideas of religious freedom, right? Of who can tell me that was not a spiritual experience, right?
And I mean, as evidenced by, what is this, about an 8-hour session?
It's probably about 4 or 5 total.
4 or 5. Does the effects of the MDMA last for that amount of time, and then you talk for an extra amount of time, or in total you're probably about 5 or 6 hours?
So the effects of the MDMA are probably, I'd say, apparent for about 2 days. The effects of the amygdala and the fear centers being very shut down and closed off are apparent for a couple of days after. You feel kind of in the glow of MDMA is kind of the way it's described. You feel it in the glow of the MDMA. But the real psychedelic experience is about 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours.
Gotcha.
And so as the MDMA started to kind of wane, the last experience I had was this experience of, in Afghanistan, we were shooting mortar illumination rounds. And we were sitting there and waiting for an ANA platoon to ambush a Taliban squad on a known pathway that they had been moving fighters into this valley. And so we overwatched this ambush, and we watched our Afghan brothers kill about a dozen Taliban fighters. And we were firing illumination rounds. over it and watching this happen. Like
Mhm.
as they came into the kill zone, we launched our first illumination round and it cracked over them. And the whole battlefield got, just light spreads out over the battlefield. And then the ANA opened up on them and just massacred this Taliban squad. And watching that and being the one that provided light to this battlefield was a very strange experience of like providing what the Afghans needed to kill the Taliban. And sitting there and watching it was like a very it's a traumatic experience to watch other human beings die and be torn apart. I had an experience in Afghanistan of watching an RPG team like disappear because they got hit by an SPG-9 that the Afghan army fired at them. And I was, setting my mortar up to shoot at them and to kill those guys myself. And then I looked across the valley and saw this Afghan soldier let loose with an SPG-9, which is a Russian recoilless rifle. And it was a direct hit, and it was watching like 3 people cease to exist and being like shocked in that moment of like, whoa. Yeah. It's a traumatic experience to see it. You're not conditioned for that. No. It's not normal to see that. Right. And in this experience of watching these Afghans, massacre this Taliban squad, that's where it started to go into kind of a psychedelic of, it wasn't me just experiencing watching things that had already happened. I saw the Afghans turn into lions, start to tear apart Taliban. And I said to Attila, oh, my Afghan lions. And that was something that for me, like the Lion of Panjshir is, Ahmed Shah Massoud is such a hero to Afghan freedom fighters. He's a hero to a lot of American soldiers because he was the original anti-Taliban.
Yeah. Right.
His
Northern Alliance, right?
Yeah. Northern Alliance. And Ahmed Shah Massoud's son is still carrying on that battle against the Taliban, and these Afghan lions are still carrying on that fight. And I think one day, someday, maybe, I pray to God that I'll be able to go back to Afghanistan, and to go up into the Panjshir Valley and to meet these Afghan lions again that I had so much respect for on the battlefield. I had so much respect for the Afghan army because they are fearless and they fight like lions.
Yeah.
And so I had this experience of watching these Afghans turn into lions and attack them. And then I kind of started to drift off into a different path. And I saw myself, and this is something that is, very, I think, apparent for a lot of people in the psychedelic experiences. You see pictures of things and it's like a picture tells 1,000 words, right? Yeah. You can see an image and exactly the entire history of that image. And I saw myself walking, and I was wearing my armor and my rifleman's kit from Afghanistan. And I saw that like in this moment, I was at a fork in the road, right? And I could see that I had been on a warpath for a dozen years, right? And that as I'm thinking, I was like, oh, wow, I actually been about a dozen years since I went to Iraq. Like, oh, wow, I have been on a warpath for a dozen years. And the Robert Frost poem about, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I chose the one less, and it's made all the difference in my life, right? That's been a very meaningful poem to me in a lot of moments in my life because I haven't chosen the normal, the prescribed path. Like I decided to all of my friends are going to college. I'm going to drop out and join the army, and I'm going to join the infantry. Yeah. And making a decision of I did my time in Iraq, but I want to lead men in combat. I want to lead men in combat. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to go down the path of being a sergeant and go to Afghanistan and lead men in combat. And I saw myself at this diversion in the road, and I could look down the path to the left. And what I saw old men. I saw veterans of the First and the Second World Wars, Korea and Vietnam and Desert Storm, and then our conflicts. Mm-hmm. And they were men that had all aged kind of at the point of where they were at. The First World War veterans and the Second World War veterans were very old men. In Korean War were very old men. In the Vietnam era were in their 70s and the Desert Storm guys are in their 50s. And it was guys my age who were still in their uniforms from Iraq and Afghanistan. And they were, you know, the videos of the old, they have like the 80-year-old paratroopers and they have him dressed up in the, they got him in his 82nd Airborne and he's singing like Blood Upon the Risers.
Yeah.
It was like that, but they were wearing their combat gear, right? They were wearing their rifleman's kit, but they were playing war like children. And that to me was this thing of like, oh, they're trying to recapture this lost moment. They're trying to live in this time that is no more. They're stuck in this trying to live still as if they're at war.
Yeah.
Right. And I saw all of them in their uniforms, men from Vietnam in their web gear, still playing war like children. And it was like, oh, they haven't moved on.
Yeah.
They haven't made a decision to let go of the war, to leave behind their armor and their battle gear, and to leave that behind and to move forward. And then I looked down the other path, right? And it was this pathway that the pathway to the left with all the old veterans playing war in their gear and their equipment was like dark and gloomy.
Yeah.
You know? And this path to the right was full of sunshine and full of happiness and full of love. And I kind of made that decision of like, I'm going to choose the path of healing. I'm going to step off of the war path.
Yeah.
I'm going to walk down this path of healing. And that's when like the final lesson hit me, right? And it was like this, like the voice of God talking down to me and saying, you are a warrior now on a healing journey. And it was like, oh, that's right. I'm still a warrior. I've always been a warrior. You know, I've always been a warrior. I'm a warrior on a healing path now.
Right.
I'm no longer a warrior who is feeling self-determined by the conflict in which I experienced, the fights that I was in. I'm no longer bound by this great national failure that I've experienced and felt so deeply, much more deeply than I think a lot of people in our nation who didn't go fight in Afghanistan, who didn't serve in the military. Those of us who went there and those of us who fought in Afghanistan felt that as a tremendous national failure. And in those moments, I understood what those Vietnam vets must have felt watching those helicopters leave Saigon for the last time.
Yeah.
Of seeing this great national failure and our society, our 24-hour news cycle world, just, we lost 13 Americans and our, our commander-in-chief, our administration just moved on like it was nothing, like it had never happened. And Jill Biden said something a couple days ago that to me was like, how ignorant of you to say something like that because you do not understand. She said, our nation hasn't been at war for, a couple of years now. It's like, did you just forget what your husband did in Afghanistan? Did you forget that quickly within a year of the 13 men and women who gave their lives trying desperately to get people to safety? Right. They gave up their lives trying to get Afghan refugees through a terrible situation and to the opportunity to maybe make it to freedom. Did you forget that quickly? Right. And that's the society that we live in, that we have so quickly forgotten about the sacrifices that we made and the mistakes that we as a nation made, especially in Afghanistan, that this national failure felt so much deeper to us than it seemed like for everybody else, because everybody else just kind of moved on.
Yeah.
But for us, it was like, wow, never been embarrassed, of my nation. But in those moments of watching that fail, I was embarrassed, and I was embarrassed to have been an Afghan veteran, to have gone and fought, and to say, like, for what?
Right.
So you people can give it up just like that. And in those moments of now choosing this healing path was like, it is what it is. Love and acceptance. We'll allow those things to wash over us, and we'll leave all of that behind. Knowing now what we know, and to say that the next time you idiots try to send young American boys and girls to go die over something that you can't explain, I'll be the first one to say, no, you're not going to do this. Send your sons and daughters. Send the sons and daughters of senators to go die. Don't send them to go, be an accountant on some base. Send them to go like be the
rear truck.
Yeah, no, send them like the general, that Marine general. It was I believe he was the national security, one of the national security advisors during the Trump administration, who was a 4-star Marine general. And when his son said, Dad, I want to be a Marine infantry officer, he didn't say, nah, buddy, no. You're going to go be a JAG officer, or you're going to go be a finance guy. No, he said, okay, son, you want to go be an infantry officer? I'll send you to Helmand. I'll send you to Afghanistan, and I'll give you a platoon to go lead in combat. And his son went and died in Afghanistan. And that's what, for me, it's like, hey, our sons and daughters, my brothers, my friends are going to die in these wars. Not the sons and daughters of these senators, not these politicians who make these decisions, and no more. You're not going to hear support from me. And at the start of this war in Ukraine, I said, no American boys need to go die in Slavic civil wars. We can support them, we can give them weapons, but we don't need to be sending American troops to go die in some Ukrainian field for what? Something that 95% of the American people can't tell you what that war is over, nor do they even understand that there was a war going on there since 2014.
Right.
That conflict in the Donbass had been a sniper and artillery war for 8 years. Those of us who had been watching what's going on in warfare in the world knew this is a slow simmering war that's eventually going to break out.
Right.
But that wasn't talked about. And these experiences of seeing it differently now, and seeing these experiences of war and knowing like, oh, I can move forward on a healing journey. It's like people talk about the perspective shift with psychedelics. And I think that that's something that is incredibly apparent for me, was the perspective shift that I saw in these experiences. My perspective of this trauma, of these wars, of these experiences had shifted so greatly to be like, oh, that's right. You are a warrior. You continue to carry that on forward. It's how do you carry that forward?
Right.
In Native American cultures, it wasn't just, the young men that went off to war. It was also the entire tribe of the warriors, entire warrior societies. But those warrior societies weren't just made up of like 24-year-old kids. It was all of the warriors that had stacked on top of that.
Right.
Up into these guys in their 70s. Like, yeah, those elders in the tribe in their 40s and 50s weren't going out and going to war, but they were providing the experience and the healing to their, young warriors when they returned home. Yeah. It's like, that's how I can move forward as a warrior. I don't need to, like I said, play war, pretend that I'm still at war. And I see that a lot on like YouTube is filled with, cool guys doing cool guy shit and showing off their guns and this new piece of gear, as if gear does anything for you if you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
That's a lesson you learn very quickly in the infantry. Like, your gear matters about like 10%. It's about 10% is your gear. The rest of it is your training.
Yeah.
And when I see these guys, like, I think during a lot of our societal struggles that I've seen, and you see guys carrying their rifle in public and wearing body armor, but they weigh 300 pounds. Like,
yeah,
dude, you're just a loot box for somebody who hits you. Like, if you can't run, if you don't have cardio, you're dead. Like, you're going to get killed at the start of that battle, and somebody's going to take all your cool guy shit and they're going to wear it themselves.
Yeah.
And this idea people have of like, oh, if I have the cool guy gear and the cool guy shit and the cool guy gun, then I'll be, for whenever the war is, like, spend your money on training, spend your money on cardio, because that's what's going to keep you alive. But it's a consumerist warfare culture, where people want to consume and they want to make it part of their identity to be this and to have that stuff. And
it's the image of what it's like. Yes. I can play the part.
Yes.
But how do you, did you feel in the days and weeks, months after doing this session, uh, as you said, you think you can be healed from PTSD. The other side of that is PTSD kind of is with you and you continue the work. Like if you don't continue the work, some of those wounds could be reopened, things like
Yeah.
that. Did you feel like those sessions um, healed you? Or do you feel like you had to, in some way, continue on with this? You found this new perspective.
Yeah.
How did it develop and evolve?
I think it is the perspective shift and the knowledge of healing, knowing that I could do a lot of healing with counseling, seeing this other opportunity for healing, and then working to embody through the next two sessions, right? The next two MDMA sessions, where the second one was, I ended up having to have knee surgery, so I had to postpone my second one until May 13th. May 14th is a day that my battalion lost 4 men that were killed, and 13 men were wounded on that day.
Afghanistan or Iraq?
In Afghanistan.
So you were in charge of them?
No.
Oh,
I was.
Okay.
Yeah, this was in our battalion. This was Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 41st Infantry. And we lost 4 guys killed and 13 or so wounded. And so that date, May 14th, holds a lot of it's a mournful day for us. We all feel that day.
Yeah.
And so that was the day after my second session. And after that second session, I was really, I grappled in that session with attachment, to physical things, attachment to my phone, attachment to things that I had from my past, and attachment to that date, right? I have this day. I only have 365 days a year, 366 if we're lucky, right? I'm not going to spend another one of them being miserable and being sad. And I had spent in the years after, I'd get, like a lot of guys, get blind drunk on that day and cry and be mournful. And I don't look down on anybody for doing that if that's the way that they're feeling and that they believe that in that moment that's what they need to do to confront the sadness of that day. But I decided that a couple of years ago, I'd go down to Gettysburg on the 14th and just walk around a battlefield and being around. I'd go over to the cemetery, and I've always walked around and found the grave of an unknown soldier. I just sit down next to that grave and say to that soldier, you're not forgotten. I'm still here. Your brothers are still here. We haven't forgotten about you, and we do so respect the sacrifice that you have given to our nation. So I kind of, after that second session, had this experience of looking at that day of May 14th through the lens of love and through the lens of, oh God, these men loved each other so much that they were willing to die and willing to sacrifice themselves over and over and over, walking into a minefield to save each other. And it is the greatest act of love that I have ever seen, is to know and to have this experience of my brothers in Alpha Company over and over and over walked themselves into a minefield to save each other, to save each other's lives. That's the greatest act of love that I can imagine. It's the greatest act of love that I can imagine. And to look at that day through that lens, that's a massive perspective shift.
Right.
It's sad and it's mournful that young men died in a conflict that we can't particularly explain the reasons for, especially not now. But to know that the act of love and the feeling of love was so deep inside of them that they were willing to make those sacrifices changes the way that I look at that day. And it changes the way that I'll experience that day for the rest of my life. And it changes the way that my daughter will experience that day. My daughter won't experience her father getting blind drunk one day out of the year and not being able to explain to her what happened. Right? That's not going to be the experience my daughter's going to have. My daughter will be able to have an experience of knowing what it is and why men do things, why men make heroic actions in combat. It's because they love each other. It's because they have such deep, profound love for their brother that they're willing to sacrifice themselves. They're willing to give their limbs and their lives for their brothers.
Right.
She'll be able to know that in a different way that I don't think would have been available to me had I not had these MDMA sessions, had I not had the experience of going and doing these MDMA ceremonies and having this perspective shift. And that to me is like worth every penny, worth
Totally.
every dollar I paid for it, you know?
So we talked just a touch earlier about, you're obviously very well read, a historian in your own right, and understanding a lot of this before you went into it.
Yeah.
But to the veterans who may just, I just heard about this and I just found this podcast.
Yeah.
Like, what should I know and why should I do this?
Yeah, I think the first place I would start is Netflix has a great short, like a couple shows called How to Change Your Mind.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a book that you can also read by Michael Pollan where he talks about, hey, these new modalities of healing using psychedelics, there's science behind it. It's not guys taking a tab of LSD at Woodstock and,
Yeah.
there is an industry being built around this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Terrence McKenna once said, we have to figure out how to make money while saving the world, because that's the only way it'll exist in a capitalist society.
Yeah.
How do you make money saving the world?
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of, there's going to be an industry built around these psychedelic healing centers. And there's too much evidence now to stop it, and that's something is, check out How to Change Your Mind on Netflix. There's one on psilocybin. There's one, which is magic mushrooms. There's one on MDMA, which is, what I used.
Mm-hmm.
There's one on LSD, people using LSD for therapy. And there's one on peyote, mescaline, and using that that is much more the Native American ceremony, and San Pedro cactus as well, which you can go down to your local Lowe's and you can buy San Pedro cactus. That's the crazy thing about it. You get a big enough one and you dice it all up, cook it down and eat it. You will have a transformative psychedelic experience,
Oh, wow.
something that you can buy at the local Lowe's. Mm-hmm. So that's a good place to start. I think looking at the one on MDMA and looking at the one on psilocybin, because the psilocybin one, they talk about the Johns Hopkins psilocybin studies, where Johns Hopkins was giving, and I think they still do, they give psilocybin to people with terminal diagnosis of cancer, Parkinson's, things like that. And the immense alleviation of the fear of death that comes through a single psilocybin experience.
Yeah.
And that is transformative in its own right, of how do you take somebody who is going to die? I mean, I hate to break it to the listeners, Sean, but we're all going to die. Hey, if you thought you were going to live forever, like, I hate to break it to you, you're going to die. And you're going to have to approach that at some point. Mm-hmm. And if you approach your mortality with a view of like, what an incredible ride it's been, and I'm ready for the next portion of it, well, then that's how the psilocybin work that Johns Hopkins did on people whose lives were ending early.
Yeah.
And so they do a couple of interviews with people like that. And then they do interviews with people in the MDMA trials, and the people who've done MDMA therapy, and the incredible results that these people have seen. And, anecdotal evidence is anecdotal, but how many anecdotes do you need to be statistical? Because everybody that I've talked to that's undergone MDMA therapy has seen a tremendous shift in their life through 3 sessions.
Right.
What is the other modalities of healing in our society that are being talked about, right? We're talking about, I take an SSRI every day for the rest of my life. The second most prescribed medication in America is an antipsychotic drug that's used to boost the production of SSRIs. Mm-hmm. You have children on SSRIs, children on antipsychotics.
Right.
We're living in a wounded culture, in a wounded society. And we have to move past this idea of, if I take a pill and I take it every day, it's going to solve my problems. Like, no. The thing with the MDMA therapy is it's not the MDMA that does the healing. You see very clearly inside of yourself. All of the healing, all of everything I need is inside of me. It's inside of my heart. It's inside of me if I continue to work towards this healing path. Mm-hmm. If I continue to work towards being this more evolved, this more conscious version of myself, it's all inside of me. And so those shows on Netflix are a great start. And then to get a real deeper dive into the actual science of it would be to listen to Rick Doblin, Dobiln, Doblin, Rick Doblin, would be to listen to his interviews with Joe Rogan. If you go onto Spotify, you can find them. Rick Doblin has also done a TED Talk. It's a little like 12 or 15 minute talk that he did talking about this, and kind of goes through how he got the FDA to admit that this is a breakthrough therapy, right? And I think looking at those, if you're a veteran and you're interested in these kind of treatments and in this kind of healing, look at that, because that'll provide you all of the science and all of the statistics that you need.
Yeah.
If hearing other veterans talk about it isn't enough, if you say like, oh, this dude's just blowing smoke and he's, putting on a show, like, I'm not. But if you believe, sure, there's also a ton of science and a ton of statistics and a ton of studies that you can look at. They got the FDA to admit this is a breakthrough therapy. So it's not just me. I'm not the only guy talking about this.
This is what our previous guest, who was the Top Gun pilot, who talked about this. He was so passionate about what his experience was, and was like, I'm here telling you this worked. This worked for me. It can work for many other people. Don't write it off just because it's psychedelic healing and think that it's like a Woodstock thing. Like, there is a sequence of events that you go through, a ceremony you go through. This is all well put together and well organized. So
yeah. And so that for me is like this. In my third MDMA ceremony, I really saw, and it was, I think, a very cool thing about having 3 ceremonies is each one was different. The first one was very much about me encountering these very traumatic experiences, these very like moral wounds, these ego shaking moments of like, who are you? If you're willing to kill a child, are you a monster? You are a monster. You made that decision. Having to encounter all of these things, the cultural interplay between Western society and the Pashtun culture, of like feeling like in that moment of not feeling sad for that man that just lost his children, but feeling very angry, and of being the one to provide light over a battlefield that ended up in the death of 12 Taliban fighters. Like, those are still human beings. Those are still human beings. And they still, while they may have been pushed down the wrong path by their society and by their culture, they're still human beings, and they're still worthy and deserving of love. And my second one being very much about attachment and about all this attachment in my life. And the third ceremony for me was very much about what the future looks like. And where is the future going to take me? And what are the opportunities available for me? And I think very much in the future, I will be working with veterans doing psychedelic healing, because I believe so strongly in the feeling of like, as a warrior, what is the next thing? And I believe that working with veterans in this psychedelic healing and, in some ways of like, being a warrior shaman, of being able to walk with and to talk with other veterans about the experience of healing and to help expose them to the ideas of being able to heal and being able to use psychedelics to heal. Because sometimes it takes having heard somebody who's been through the same things and have gone through the same things and have seen combat of telling you, no, there is a healing here. There is healing. Right. Being able to be the one that provides that, I think, is something that for me will be a pathway for me in the future. But I think that looking at those and listening to interviews and listening to the people who have undergone these treatments, who have undergone these ceremonies, look at them with curiosity. And instead of judgment, try to remove your judgment from it. Because, if you haven't had a psychedelic experience, or you haven't had a psychedelic experience in a ceremonial setting, you don't know what we've experienced. You don't know. And it's the same way that, veterans try to get across their experiences. And you guys do such a great job of helping to connect our culture with the experience and the sacrifices of our veterans, what it is that we experienced, what it is that we did, and what it is that we saw, and trying to get that across to people, and not just the way of, you wouldn't get it, man, you weren't there. It's like, it is impossible to put into words the enormity of a psychedelic experience, and specifically the enormity of a healing ceremony, and how you walk away from that with this massively shifted perspective of going, I'm still who I am, but it's like you go into the eye doctor, 1 or 2, 2 or 3, 3 or 4. Oh, back to 3. It's like, oh, well, this dude just went like click and it's X-ray perfect vision. I'm like, oh, wow. What a new perspective,
Yeah.
you know? And for me to be able to say, like, it was 3 MDMA ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'll ever need to take.
That was beginning my next question. Do you feel like you have to go through another ceremony?
No, I'm going to do an ayahuasca ceremony in October. I'm very excited for that.
Mm-hmm.
For that being this, very, very intense psychedelic experience. And I'll come on and talk to you about that whenever I get back from that, if you'd like.
Definitely.
Talk about that. There's a lot of veterans now doing things like ayahuasca, doing things like ibogaine therapy. Dakota Meyer has been very open about using ibogaine therapy in Mexico.
Yeah.
And then using 5-MeO-DMT after it. And how these psychedelics, when used in the proper set and used in a ceremonial healing way, are incredibly, incredibly beneficial and are massively life-changing. For people like Dakota Meyer, who had struggled mightily with his experiences in combat, the guy won a Medal of Honor and he feels like he failed. He's been given this ultimate award by our society and feels like he failed because he didn't save his team.
Right.
And for him to have an experience of saying like, oh, I was able to see all of the perspective shift of that day, And I think that that's the thing to get across to people is, hey, I was a lot like a lot of people when I heard people talk. I was, straight-laced sergeant in the Army, maybe not straight-laced, but, I like to go out and drink with my buddies on the weekend, just like every other infantryman. But it was very much like, oh, these people talking about expanding their consciousness and expanding their mind. I think hippies, they don't know what they're like.
Yeah.
Until you experience it. And it is the absolute, yep, my consciousness was expanded. The ability for me to be aware of myself, to be aware of my own patterns, to be aware of my own thought patterns and my own processes, just in how I connect in my relationship with my wife.
I was going to, again, you're reading my mind. My next question would be like, a lot of people say, well, my wife, my daughter, my dad, they all noticed a change in me. Yeah. And how did your wife, like, what did she say after you came back? Was she like, this is a brand new Adam, or,
like a changed man?
Yeah.
A changed man. And one thing that I've been very apparent to me in just like every married couple, we have fights and we have arguments, One of the things that for me was very apparent to me was I have I try to stay away from the fight. But then once it's there, it's like my wife calls it, I go into attack mode. And it's like, I'm very like, and that to me is like, that's the PTSD response of trying to avoid conflict. But when it's here, like, hey, anybody will tell you when you get ambushed, the first thing that you try to do is gain fire superiority. You put as much lead out towards the enemy as possible. And that to me is how I would operate in a fight with my wife of like, well, here we go. And bang, 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 bang. Throwing as much lead back as I possibly could, right?
Yeah.
Well, now I am much more able to see the pattern building. And even if I like, hey, I'm taking a shot at you. It's like, okay, I can see that pattern. I can recognize that as a pattern in a pathway that I don't want to go down. And I would much rather say, Alex, I'm sorry. I apologize for how I responded. In the moment, I'm not willing to talk about that. I'm not open to talk about that. I'm not able to have this conversation right now. I love you. We can talk about this tomorrow. We can talk about this next week. And that to me has been something that she's also noticed and also said of like your ability to de-escalate a conflict, which could turn into, us arguing and fighting and then like not talking to each other for a couple days and being like very distant is like, doesn't really happen anymore because I'm able to like switch out of that attack mode and go, I can see that I'm going into the attack mode and I don't want to go into attack mode. I want to go into loving and caring for my wife. loving and caring for my daughter, you
Yeah.
know? And that to me is this experience of like, I didn't want to be the angry veteran. I didn't want to be that man in my daughter's life because I didn't want her to grow up with an angry father, you know?
Yeah.
And I never had that experience. My dad is one of the most loving and kind human beings imaginable. But I had seen friends who had angry fathers, you know, and I know guys that I served with whose fathers were alcoholics or were angry or were violent.
Right.
And that to me was like, I'm not going to be that angry veteran.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the most loving, kind, and gentle human being that I possibly can. Mm-hmm. And inside of that is the knowledge of being a warrior, of like knowing what you are capable of. I think very few people have an understanding of the capability for violence they hold inside of them. But
yeah,
infantrymen who have been in combat have a very real life experience of, oh, I'm capable of violence, I'm capable of damage,
right.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And wanting to say, oh, in my life, I'm not going to be that angry veteran. I'm not going to yell at my daughter. I'm not going to do that. I'm
right.
going to choose a different pathway forward as being for me like a profound and life-shifting, life-changing experience.
Probably the biggest lesson out of it. Not only the perspective change on your experiences, the moral injuries, all of it, but being able to be given a choice now.
Being able to catch and see patterns, because that's what they are in your brain, and they're patterns. And that's something that people, MDMA and psilocybin, one of the things that I've been doing, I think, is because I still have patterns where I get into depressive patterns and I get into down moments. And one of the things that I've found is, for me, microdosing of psilocybin has been incredibly helpful in lifting me out of depressions and lifting me out of down periods. And in the way that psilocybin works, psilocybin helps to create new neural pathways in your brain. And it helps you to recognize in a way of like, I see that pathway in my brain. It's grooved in there, right?
Yeah.
It's grooved in there.
Right.
But psilocybin helps to rewire your brain and to build new neural pathways around problems. And I can, you can say like, oh, I can feel it, I can see it. Like, no, I can look at things in a different way. I can see a pattern arising and see it as just that. It's a pattern. And I can make a decision in the moment of following down that pattern, or I can make a decision to, let's find a new solution to this. Because oftentimes anger is your response to this. The fucker cut me off in traffic, right?
Right.
Instead of going like, I, in this moment, could get angry and I could get frustrated and I could shake my steering wheel and I could ruin the rest of my day over somebody cutting me off. Or I could say, I guess they got somewhere real important to be.
Right.
Hey, that's all right. Fine. Cool. Go ahead. I'm going to go about my day and I'm going to live here in this joyful world. Nobody's shooting at me. Nothing's blowing up. I get to live this wonderful life. And isn't that a better way to go about it?
Yeah.
Than to being triggered and sent down a pathway of anger and frustration and going, Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people that meditate say that about themselves. Through deep meditation work, you are able to notice and to see patterns in your life and go, I don't want to go down that pattern.
Right.
Go down this pattern. I want to go down this pathway instead.
So interesting. Well, Adam, this has been very thorough and exceptionally thorough, because I think that anybody who might be looking to use this modality, this is a great way for them to be exposed to it through what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I really want to thank you for sharing and being yourself and being honest about what all this is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's something for me that out of that third MDMA session was like, I need to be more vocal about this. I need to talk about this more openly. And I don't particularly care what anyone thinks about it. I don't care if you have judgment over me using MDMA and psychedelics to heal myself, because would you rather I be a damaged veteran who cannot move past my experiences? Or would you rather I be the best father possible for my daughter? If I'm asking anyone else that question, I would say to them, I would much rather you be a veteran who is healed from your wounds and is able to be the best husband, the best father, the best citizen possible, rather than feeling damaged or feeling broken or feeling like you have been determined by this national failure, whatever it is,
Right.
you know? And for everybody out there, veteran or not, I don't believe that MDMA therapy is just for people with PTSD. I think we can all see a massive benefit from having just one of these experiences in your life. Just one experience in your life where you are able to see through a new lens and through a new perspective. And that to me is like, we're going to be moving into a culture, hopefully, where we talk about psychedelics more openly and we talk about the benefits of them. And we talk about how this isn't just for guys with PTSD.
Right.
This is for everybody can benefit from the proper usage of these. I'm not saying go take MDMA and no, do this through a actual healing
procedural
through the people who are actually doing this work.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I was going to say, do you have any final words? But I think that sums it up perfectly. And to our listeners, if you're interested in this, we're going to have more links into the description. I'm happy to connect any of our listeners with Adam if you're okay with that, Adam, to
absolutely, of course,
let them know all about where they need to go. We'll make sure to get the word out, but also like, share, subscribe, ring the bell on YouTube, and you can connect with me at Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Adam, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you guys.
Always
thank you
a pleasure.
so much, Sean.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for allowing me to speak about this and allowing me to share this healing that I've seen with other veterans and with the people out there listening, because it's going to be incumbent upon us as citizens to say to our representatives and to say to our government, like, hey, stop fighting the lost drug war, especially when it comes to things like this, because you're fighting a losing battle and you're doing harm. You are doing more harm than good when you're trying to make this impossible to access. You're doing more harm than good. And it's incumbent upon us to say to our representatives, like, it's time to change.
It'll certainly become more a part of the social conscience. People understand and hear more about it, especially from your very positive experience. I think that, it'll hopefully continue to gain root.
Cool.
All right. And for our listeners, we'll see you on another episode of the Scuttlebutt. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching this episode of The Scuttlebutt. I'd like to take a moment to thank both of our sponsors, the first being D&D Metal Recycling and Auto Salvage. They began as a small hauling and used auto parts operation in the Pittsburgh area in the late 1970s, but they've grown into a full-service metal recycling company with 2 locations, Lawrenceville and Tarentum. D&D accepts all types of metal, both ferrous and non-ferrous, that may be generated by industrial manufacturing, construction, and demolition, small commercial entities, as well as individual customers. They have a wide variety of material handling equipment and are capable of managing any type of job in a timely and efficient manner. You can contact them for quotes and availability at D&D. That's D&D autosalvage.com. Thank you so much to D&D. They've been a sponsor for quite some time, and we really appreciate their support. The second being tobacco-free Adagio Health. They are dedicated to reducing and preventing tobacco use and to getting the word out about the hazards of smoking and secondhand smoke. They're all about health. So they want people to quit, and they have classes and nicotine replacement therapy and a popular quit line, which is the easiest number to remember ever, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. They also educate people, children especially, about tobacco use from cigarettes, cigars, pipes, chew, snuff, and other nicotine products like vaping. Finally, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health advocates for public and private policies that ensure healthy places to live, work, and play. You can learn all of what Tobacco-Free Adagio Health offers at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org, or you can watch our recent episode with Tobacco-Free Adagio Health on the Scuttlebutt, where they talk about a lot of the programs that they offer for those who are looking to quit. Thank you to both of our sponsors for their continued support of the Scuttlebutt podcast. We really appreciate it. Thanks.